Welcome to WWO Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. Late 1944. The Allied war machine grinds relentlessly toward the heart of Germany. But before them lies a formidable obstacle, not of concrete and steel alone, but of earth and wood, a primeval landscape of dense, dark forest. This is the Hürtgenwald, a 50-square-mile expanse of forbidding terrain on the German-Belgian border. To the American GIs who fought there, it had another name, the meat grinder. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest was not a battle of grand, sweeping maneuvers. It was a slugging match in a labyrinth of towering fir trees, deep ravines, and muddy trails. The autumn rains were incessant, turning the forest floor into a quagmire of cold, clinging mud that swallowed boots, vehicles, and hope. A perpetual twilight reigned beneath the dense canopy, where visibility was often reduced to mere yards. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and the ever-present odor of cordite and death. Artillery was the king of this battlefield. The Germans, masters of defense, had pre-registered their firing coordinates on every trail, clearing, and crossroads. The horrifying sound of screaming Mimes, the Nebelwerfer rockets, and the instantaneous crack of shells exploding in the treetops, a phenomenon soldiers called tree bursts, filled the air. These explosions rained down a lethal shower of hot steel splinters and wooden shrapnel, making a mockery of foxholes and conventional cover. Casualties from these tree bursts were catastrophic, shredding infantry units and shattering morale. For the American soldiers, many of them green replacements, the Hürtgen was a disorienting, terrifying hell. They were fighting an almost invisible enemy, skilled in camouflage and ambush. Every shadow could hide a machine gun nest, every fallen log a sniper. Worse still were the mines. The forest was laced with them, part of the formidable West Wall or Siegfried Line defenses. The Germans had sown the ground with Teller mines capable of destroying a tank, and the dreaded Schumann 42 and glass mines, virtually undetectable and designed to maim rather than kill. This grim landscape was also home to a particularly notorious minefield, given a chillingly pastoral name by the Germans, Wilde Sau, or Wild Boar. It was a place where a single misstep meant oblivion, a patch of ground sown with indiscriminate death, waiting silently in the cold German soil. Amidst this relentless carnage, commanding a company of German soldiers, was Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld. At only 23 years old, Lengfeld was a product of his time, an officer in the Wehrmacht tasked with defending his homeland against a seemingly unstoppable tide. Born in 1921, he had come of age as the Nazi regime consolidated its power and plunged Europe into war. Like millions of other young German men, he was drawn into the military, serving on the brutal Eastern Front where he had been decorated for bravery. His experiences there had undoubtedly hardened him, exposing him to a level of savagery that few could comprehend. Yet, somewhere within this battle-tested officer, a core of decency remained, a flicker of humanity that even the horrors of total war could not extinguish. By November 1944, Lengfeld was the company commander of the 2nd Company of the Fusilier Battalion, 275th Infantry Division. His unit was dug in, occupying a forester's lodge that served as their command post, designated Bunker 131 on German military maps. Their position was precarious, right on the front lines of the Huertgenwald. Day and night were a monotonous cycle of artillery barrages, patrols into the shadowy woods, and the gnawing tension of waiting for the next American assault. The men under his command were a mix of veterans and hastily trained replacements, all weary from years of war. Their equipment was strained, their supplies dwindling, but their resolve to defend their positions remained firm. Life in the bunkers was cold, damp, and miserable. The constant shelling frayed nerves, and the sight of comrades falling daily took a heavy psychological toll. In this environment, survival often depended on stripping away sentiment, on viewing the enemy not as men, but as faceless targets, mere obstacles to be eliminated. The relentless propaganda of the regime reinforced this dehumanization. The American soldiers were invaders, aggressors to be fought with bitter resolve to the last man. For an officer like Lengfeld, the pressure to conform, to lead his men with ruthless efficiency, was immense. Any perceived weakness could undermine his authority and endanger his entire company. He was responsible for their lives, and his duty was clear: to hold the line, to kill the enemy, and to survive. Yet, the story that would define his life and his death was not one of military tactics or strategic victory, but of a singular, profound choice that defied the very nature of the war he was fighting. Facing Lengfeld's position were the soldiers of the American 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, part of the 4th Infantry Division. Nicknamed the Ivy Division, they were a battle-hardened unit that had landed on Utah Beach on D-Day and fought their way across France. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for the Hürtgen. The tactics that had worked in the open fields of Normandy were useless here. Tanks were confined to narrow, muddy tracks where they were easy prey for German anti-tank guns. Coordinated movements dissolved into a series of isolated, small-unit firefights. Platoons and companies became lost, separated from their support and command, fighting desperate, lonely battles against a ghostly enemy. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers suffered from combat fatigue at an alarming rate. The constant dampness led to trench foot, and the cold was a persistent, bone-chilling misery. The GIs felt trapped, claustrophobic, convinced that the entire forest was a single, vast German ambush. Every tree seemed to conceal a threat, and the ground itself was lethal. On the morning of November 12, 1944, the order came down for another push. The objective was the same as always: to gain a few hundred more yards of this cursed forest, to dislodge the German defenders from their well-prepared positions. The men of the 22nd Infantry Regiment moved out at dawn, into the cold mist that clung to the forest floor. The advance was slow and nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig could be an enemy soldier. Every rustle of leaves a prelude to an attack. The advance was met with the familiar, ferocious resistance. German machine guns, including the dreaded MG-42 with its terrifying rate of fire, tore through the trees. Mortar rounds walked across the American lines, and artillery, as always, rained down from above. The attack stalled. Units were pinned down, taking heavy casualties, trying to find any semblance of cover in the unforgiving terrain. It was during this chaotic assault that a squad of American soldiers found themselves advancing directly towards the Wildau minefield. Unaware of the precise danger that lay just ahead, concealed beneath a thin layer of soil and pine needles, they pressed forward, focused on the German positions at the Forester's Lodge. The stage was set for a tragedy, a single, explosive moment that would cut through the din of battle and present one German officer with an impossible choice. In the chaos of the stalled American attack, a lone GI pushed forward, his focus locked on the enemy ahead. He moved through the churned-up earth and splintered trees, his world narrowed to the few yards of treacherous ground in front of him. Then a sudden, sharp click under his boot, followed by a deafening roar. The soldier was thrown violently through the air as an anti-personnel mine detonated, its blast ripping through his body. The explosion sent a shockwave through the immediate area, a brutal punctuation mark in the ongoing firefight. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then the battle raged on. But the soldier, grievously wounded, was now stranded. He had fallen in the middle of the Wildau minefield, a no-man's land between the American and German lines. The blast had not killed him instantly. As the initial shock wore off, he began to cry out. His calls were not of aggression or defiance, but of pure, raw agony and fear. Cries of "Help me!" and "Medic!" pierced the air, audible to both sides. To the Americans, pinned down by heavy fire, it was a sound of horror and helplessness. They could hear their comrade, could feel his suffering, but reaching him seemed impossible. Any attempt to cross the open, mine-infested ground under the guns of the German defenders would be a suicide mission. Their training, their instincts, screamed at them to stay down, to survive. To the Germans in Bunker 131, the cries were a chilling distraction. They were the sounds of a dying enemy, something that, in the cold calculus of war, should have been ignored or even welcomed. The soldier was a threat neutralized, a testament to the effectiveness of their defenses. The normal response would be to watch, to wait, and to fire upon anyone who dared to attempt a rescue. It was a grim, established rule of this brutal form of warfare, but the cries were relentless. They cut through the noise of machine guns and mortars, a human sound in an inhuman landscape. It was a voice stripped of uniform, nationality, and allegiance. It was simply the sound of a young man, thousands of miles from home, dying in agony and begging for help. For the soldiers on both sides, hunkered down in their muddy foxholes and cold bunkers, that sound hung in the air, a haunting reminder of their shared, fragile mortality. It was a sound that could not be easily ignored, a plea that seemed to demand a response, even from an enemy. Inside the German command post, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld heard the Americans' cries just as clearly as his men did. For hours, the painful pleas echoed across the battlefield, a constant, harrowing soundtrack to the stalemate. For Lengfeld, this was more than just the sound of a wounded enemy. He was a commander responsible for the morale and discipline of his company. The unceasing cries of the American soldier were unnerving his men, a grim reminder of what could, and often did, happen to any of them. But it was more than a tactical problem. The sound gnawed at his conscience. This was not an abstract enemy anymore. It was a specific human being, suffering immensely just a short distance away. Every soldier is trained to dehumanize the enemy. It is a necessary psychological shield for survival, a way to cope with the act of killing. You fight the uniform, not the man inside it. But the cries from the minefield were breaking down that barrier, forcing Lengfeld and his soldiers to confront the humanity of the man they were supposed to be killing. He could see the effect on his men's faces, the unease, the pity, the shared horror. The brutal logic of war dictated that he do nothing. The wounded soldier was an American problem. Any attempt at rescue would be an opportunity to inflict more casualties. That was his duty. His oath, his training, and the entire machinery of the German war effort demanded it. Yet, another duty was calling to him, a more fundamental human duty. To ignore the suffering of another person, even an enemy, felt profoundly wrong. He paced the confines of his bunker, the soldiers' pleas ringing in his ears. He was faced with a stark choice. He could follow his military orders, maintaining the cold discipline of a frontline officer and let the American die. Or he could listen to the voice of his own conscience, an act that would defy military protocol, risk the lives of his own men, and go against the very grain of the war he was fighting. It was a decision that could be seen as treasonous by his superiors or as weakness by his enemies. In a moment that would define his legacy, Friedrich Lengfeld made his choice. He would not allow a man to die like that, alone in a minefield, while he stood by and did nothing. He decided that humanity would take precedence over hostility. He turned to his men, his expression firm. His next order would be one of the most unusual ever given in the Hürtgen Forest. Lieutenant Lengfeld issued his order, and its effect was immediate and profound. He commanded his soldiers to hold their fire. No one was to shoot at the wounded American. Furthermore, and more astonishingly, he ordered that if any American medics attempted a rescue, they were not to be fired upon. This was an act of incredible chivalry, a localized, unofficial ceasefire declared unilaterally in the midst of one of the war's most savage battles. A strange quiet began to settle over their sector of the front. The German machine guns, which had been chattering incessantly, fell silent. The riflemen held their positions, watching and waiting, their fingers off their triggers. On the American side, the lull in the firing must have been met with suspicion and confusion. Was it a trick? A prelude to a German counterattack? They remained on high alert, but the cries of their wounded comrade continued unabated, now filling the silence with even greater poignancy. Lengfeld watched and waited. He hoped that the cessation of fire would be seen as a gesture of goodwill, an invitation for the Americans to retrieve their man without fear of being shot. He was offering them a window of opportunity, a brief respite from the barbarity of war to perform an act of mercy. He was extending a hand across no man's land, not in surrender, but in shared humanity. But the hours dragged on and no rescue attempt was made. The reasons were tragically understandable. The American commanders might have distrusted the sudden silence, forbidding any movement. The medics themselves may have been casualties, or they may have judged the risk of the minefield to be too great, even without the threat of enemy fire. For the men pinned down, the prospect of crossing that open, death-trapped ground was still terrifying. They were exhausted, battered, and had seen too much to take such a risk. The unofficial truce held, but the American soldier remained, his cries growing weaker as his life ebbed away in the cold mud. The silence itself became a source of immense tension. Every soldier on both sides was acutely aware of the drama unfolding between their lines. The battle had paused, frozen by the suffering of one man and the conscience of another. It was a surreal tableau. Two opposing armies, locked in a death struggle, temporarily united as silent witnesses to a lone soldier's agony. The unspoken truce was a fragile, momentary bubble of peace in a sea of war, created by Lengfeld's moral courage. But as time slipped away, it became clear that this passive gesture was not enough. The American was not going to be saved by his own side. If anything was to be done, Lengfeld would have to do more than simply hold his fire. He would have to act. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, eerie shadows through the shattered trees of the Huertgenwald, Lieutenant Lengfeld knew he could wait no longer. The Americans' cries had become faint, intermittent moans. If there was any chance of saving him, it was now or never. Since the Americans would not or could not mount a rescue, Lengfeld decided he would. He turned to his own men, the very soldiers whose job it was to kill the man in the minefield, and began to organize a German rescue party. He called for his chief medic, Stabsgefreiter Hubert Gies, and several other medical personnel. He explained his plan. They would go out into the Wilde Sow, under the protection of a Red Cross marker, and bring the American soldier back to the German lines for medical treatment. It was an audacious, almost unbelievable plan. It defied every rule of engagement and put them all in extreme danger, not only from the mines, but also from the possibility of a misunderstanding by the American forces who might not honor the Red Cross symbol. The German medics, though likely stunned by the order, did not hesitate. They gathered their supplies: stretchers, bandages, morphine, and plasma. The most crucial piece of equipment was a large pole flying a Red Cross flag, the internationally recognized symbol of medical neutrality. This flag was their only shield, a fragile appeal to a code of conduct that was often forgotten in the heat of battle. Lengfeld himself would lead the mission. He felt a personal responsibility. It was his conscience that had driven him this far, and he would not send his men into such danger without sharing the risk. He briefed them quickly, outlining the path they would take, emphasizing the need for extreme caution. Every man in the rescue party understood the immense peril. The Wilde Sow was their own minefield. They knew how deadly it was. They had laid some of these mines themselves, but they also knew their commander. They trusted his judgment and were moved by his extraordinary display of compassion. They were no longer Wehrmacht soldiers preparing to fight an enemy. They were simply men, preparing to save another man's life. As the small group assembled at the edge of their position, a hush fell over the German line. Soldiers watched in awe as their young lieutenant and the medics, holding their Red Cross flag high, prepared to step out of the relative safety of their bunker and into the deadly ground of no man's land. It was a moment suspended in time, an act of moral clarity in a world consumed by madness. With the Red Cross flag held aloft, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld led his small team of medics out from their fortified position. The air was cold and still. The sun was low, its weak light filtering through the skeletal trees. Every eye, German and American, was fixed on this small group of men as they began to slowly and deliberately make their way towards the wounded American soldier. Lengfeld was at the front, carefully picking his way through the treacherous terrain. He knew the general layout of the Wildau minefield, but precise memory in such a chaotic environment was impossible. Mines could shift with the rain and mud, and new ones could have been laid. He prodded the ground ahead of him, his senses on high alert, listening for the faint click or feeling for the subtle pressure of a trigger plate. The medics followed directly in his footsteps, carrying the stretcher and their medical kits. The tension was almost unbearable. They were completely exposed, vulnerable to fire from a nervous American rifleman who might not understand what was happening, and vulnerable to the hidden death that lay just inches beneath the soles of their boots. They moved with excruciating slowness, yard by agonizing yard. They were about halfway to the American soldier when it happened. In a moment of terrible irony, while trying to save a man from a mine, Lengfeld triggered one himself. It was a German-laid anti-personnel mine, likely a Schumann 42, designed to blow a man's foot off and inflict a severe, often fatal, wound. The explosion was not as large as an anti-tank mine, but at point-blank range, it was devastating. Lengfeld was thrown to the ground, a sharp, piercing cry torn from his lips. The blast had grievously injured him, sending shrapnel deep into his body and causing severe internal wounds. The rescue mission collapsed in an instant. The medics, shocked and horrified, immediately rushed to their commander's side. The wounded American soldier, so close to being saved, was forgotten. The German medics worked frantically to stabilize their lieutenant, applying field dressings to his terrible wounds. The dream of a humanitarian rescue had turned into a desperate struggle to save their own leader. They carefully placed him on the stretcher that had been intended for the American and began the perilous journey back to their own lines. The unspoken truce was shattered by the blast, and the grim reality of the Hürtgen Forest came crashing back. The war had reclaimed its own, punishing an act of compassion with its own indiscriminate cruelty. The medics carried their fallen commander back to the relative safety of the forester's lodge. He was in excruciating pain, but conscious. They did everything they could for him at the battalion aid station, but his injuries were catastrophic. The shrapnel from the anti-personnel mine had caused massive internal damage that was far beyond the capabilities of frontline medics to treat. A few hours later, on the evening of November 12, 1944, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld died from his wounds. He was just 23 years old. His final act was not one of combat or conquest, but an attempt to save the life of an enemy soldier, a gesture of profound humanity for which he paid the ultimate price. His death sent a shockwave of grief and disbelief through his company. They had lost a respected and brave commander, not in the heat of battle, but in an act of mercy. The tragic irony of his death was not lost on them. The fate of the American soldier, whose cries had set this entire tragedy in motion, is not officially recorded. It is almost certain that he too perished in the minefield. Without medical attention, his severe injuries would have been fatal. His name and identity are lost to history. An unknown soldier whose suffering prompted an extraordinary act of courage, creating a bond in death with the enemy officer who tried to save him. The battle for the Hürtgen Forest raged on, consuming thousands more lives on both sides. In the grand scale of the war, the death of one young lieutenant and one unknown GI was a minor statistic, a footnote in a campaign notorious for its high cost and questionable strategic value. The story of Lengfeld's sacrifice was quickly buried under the weight of continued fighting. His men would have remembered, but official records would only note that he was killed in action. For the Americans, the incident was likely never fully understood. They would have heard the explosion and assumed a German soldier had been careless in his own minefield. The context, the motivation, the incredible act of humanity behind that explosion remained unknown to them for decades. The war moved on, and the Hürtgen Forest fell silent, its ground filled with the ghosts of the men who fought and died there, including a German lieutenant and the American he died trying to save. Their story became one of the forest's many secrets, waiting for a time of peace to be unearthed. For 50 years, the story of Friedrich Lengfeld remained largely forgotten, a private memory held by the men who served under him. The world moved on from the ashes of World War II. Germany was rebuilt, and the former enemies became allies. The veterans of the conflict grew old, their memories of the war fading for some, but remaining vividly present for others. For the American veterans of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, the memories of the Hürtgen Forest were particularly stark. It was a battle that had left deep scars on all who survived it. In the early 1990s, as the 50th anniversary of the end of the war approached, veterans groups began organizing reunions and trips back to the old battlefields of Europe. It was during this period of reflection and reconciliation that the story of Lieutenant Lengfeld's sacrifice resurfaced. Through historical research and possibly contact with German veteran associations, the 22nd Infantry Regiment Society learned of the incredible events of November 12, 1944. They discovered that a German officer, an enemy commander, had died while trying to save one of their own men. The story resonated deeply with these former soldiers. They understood, better than anyone, the courage it would have taken to do what Lengfeld did. They knew the hatred and dehumanization that war fosters, which made his act of compassion all the more remarkable. They felt a sense of profound gratitude and a duty to honor the memory of this man. They decided that this act of moral courage could not remain an obscure footnote in history. They wanted to create a lasting tribute to the German officer who had embodied the highest ideals of honor and humanity, even in the midst of war's deepest darkness. The veterans of the 22nd Infantry Regiment, the same unit that Lengfeld had been fighting against, took it upon themselves to raise funds and commission a monument. This was an unprecedented gesture. Former combatants honoring an enemy officer was rare, if not unheard of. It was a testament to the power of Lengfeld's story to transcend national loyalties and the bitterness of past conflicts. It was an act of reconciliation, a bridge built across the decades, connecting former enemies through a shared respect for a moment of pure, selfless heroism. On October 7, 1994, almost exactly 50 years after his death, a monument to Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld was officially dedicated. It stands today in the Hürtgen War Cemetery, the final resting place for thousands of German soldiers who died in the battle. The monument was placed not far from Lengfeld's own grave. Its creation and placement were a collaborative effort, a symbol of the peace that now existed between Germany and the United States. The monument is simple yet powerful. It is a slab of local stone, rough-hewn, blending with the somber, wooded landscape of the cemetery. Affixed to the stone is a bronze plaque, its text written in both German and English, a message for all who visit. The plaque was commissioned and paid for by the veterans of the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. The inscription is a moving tribute that captures the essence of Lengfeld's sacrifice. It reads, "Here in the Hürtgen War Cemetery rests Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld. On November 12, 1944, he gave his life while trying to save a wounded American soldier in the minefield between our lines. No man hath greater love than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." The quote from the Gospel of John is traditionally used to honor soldiers who die for their comrades. Its application here, to a man who died for his enemy, is what makes the monument so extraordinary. It redefines the concept of friendship, suggesting a deeper human connection that war cannot erase. The monument to Friedrich Lengfeld is more than just a memorial to one man. It is a powerful symbol of reconciliation. It stands as a testament to the idea that even in the most brutal of conflicts, individual acts of conscience and humanity can shine through. It is an acknowledgement from one group of soldiers to another that courage is not just about fighting, but also about the strength to show mercy. Each year, visitors to the Hürtgen Cemetery, including American and German tour groups, students and historians, stop at this unique memorial. They read the inscription and learn the story of a young German officer whose final act has become an enduring lesson in compassion. A quiet but powerful voice from the past reminding us of our shared humanity. A light that flickered briefly in the darkness of the meat grinder. Thank you for joining WW Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.